I also always felt that kind of creativity was scalable, right? Like if you genuinely create something good, you can kind of like take it everywhere, right? And if you were someone that can create value from nothing, that had to be worth something, right? So I always felt like, that was an important attribute to have, right?
You're listening to Creative Leadership with Heart, a podcast that inspires people to take action and be the leader they were born to be. I'm Coach Rico, and I'm known for coaching and training executives, leaders, founders, and high performers at Fortune 100 businesses, startups, and more. I'm here to answer your questions about leadership and personal development while also asking you questions that can unlock your untapped potential. Everyone, welcome back to another episode of Creative Leadership with Heart. Today, my special guest, Phil Rhie, 15 years in the product design space. His career spans the landscape from startups to private technology companies, and currently he is a lead product designer at Experian and also a little bit under the weather. I think he's doing a little bit better getting over the cold, but we're going to get through it. Welcome, Phil.
Cool. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, thank you for joining. So jumping right into it, I'm not going to get into the quote yet because I want to get into it after we learn a little bit about you, because it was in the pre-show for those listening, he dropped a cool quote that I'm actually steal from you. So tell us a little bit about your journey as a creative. What was it about creativity, product design that got you to where you are? And was there a moment that you're like, this is what I want to do?
Yeah, and I'll try not to be long-winded, but the short of it basically is I really struggled as a kid trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and that's just for a variety of reasons. And I came out of school with a computer science degree, but I always had a passion for drawing and art and illustrations, and I really wanted to go down that route. On the side too, I also made a ton of websites in my free time, mostly just to kind of like show off my art as a kid. And when I got into the workspace, it turned out I didn't enjoy engineering enough to be a programmer. I wasn't good enough to be an illustrator, but there was a demand for websites at the time and for people who can actually build stuff from the ground up. So I started doing that, and I think context here is how I ended up in product design. Is that so much of my personal philosophy is rooted in kind of financial freedom. And I was always trying to find ways to kind of continue to empower myself. And I had this thing that I knew was valuable, but I didn't know how to like basically cash in on it. And as I started to kind of try to learn how to make more money, try to learn how to like grow in this space, I met a lot of folks who were calling themselves UX designers at the time. That was kind of the brand new thing. This was, years ago, just for context again. And, I figured out like, I felt like I understood technology and products better than some of these folks, yet these folks were clearly living better than me. So I started to kind of put my head down and figure out what this space was and what this is. And also I've learned too that the designers in a corporate space tend to be kind of the cool kids in the room. They're always kind of like dressed colorfully. They had tattoos, and I was always kind of like, that seems really cool to be able to do that. So I just kind of followed that path and try to find ways to get better at it, try to find opportunities for myself, and here we are. That's the short of it, really.
Nice. And what was that moment? Was it purely that, like, dude, UX designers make more, I'm a web designer, I'm gonna pivot?
It wasn't even like, to be, what's funny, it's like web design is a really broad kind of space,
Mm-hmm.
and UX design, by comparison, in my opinion, is like a small fraction of it. So it wasn't even kind of like, I felt like I was doing a lot, and I was kind of like stretching myself thin. And I realized, and this is just kind of key in everything, but like UX designers are specialized in this one thing and this one aspect of web design. And it occurred to me that these folks were doing more with less, and it gave them time back in some ways too. So that was kind of why I pursued it. I was like, these folks, they seem to be living better, basically, comparatively. So I was like, I need to know what they're doing. And that's really kind of the motivation for me to kind of just go down that path.
Yeah. So what was it that made you choose computer science? Because I mean, you said you like illustration, you like design, you like those things, but you went for a CS degree.
Man, oh, excuse me. So, again, the preface here is really that I was a confused kid. But the thing that also is pretty informative to my character is understanding that I loved video games growing up, and I still love video games.
Mhm.
And when I didn't know what I wanted to do, I actually applied to every single college that I went into, undeclared, except for the college that I did end up at, which is UCSD. I couldn't find the undeclared option, so I had to choose something. And in the back of my mind, I was like thinking, well, I like computers, I make websites, and like I think video games, I know that you have to be a programmer to do that. Why don't I just kind of choose this for what at the time I thought was my backup school? I was like, I'll just kind of like send in this application and just kind of run with it. And fate being what it is, I ended up at that school. I ended up with a computer science degree. And halfway through, when I realized like how hard it was, I kind of crossed the bridge of no return, and then just kind of just pushed through and just ended up with the degree.
Nice. I have two questions in there. Let me do the illustration one, and I do want to get back into the financial freedom point you brought up because I
Yeah.
think it's an interesting one. So the illustration, you said you weren't good enough. Do you still illustrate, and what made you think that you weren't good enough as an illustrator?
Oh man. It's not just that I wasn't good enough. I think I'm fine. Like I'll pop it out here and there when I'm drawing like doodles or whatever. My son thinks it's actually pretty cool. But you know what it was? I realized that I didn't love it enough. Like
Mm-hmm.
I always had a high standard for these things, and I had like benchmarks and like role models, I guess, in the space that I thought were excellent at what they do. And then again, looking at the financial freedom side, I realized that I was, to put it candidly, I was bougier than I gave myself credit for. I loved going and buying expensive coffees, and then as I grew older, I enjoyed cocktails, and I realized like I love that more than I actually loved illustrating. And the folks who are really good at it, that's all they live and breathe. So I had to have an honest conversation with myself and kind of say, like, I don't think I love this enough. And the other counterpoint too is that I was pretty good at it, but I also felt like I was stealing jobs from people who genuinely wanted to grow in this space.
Mm.
And that put a little bit of guilt, whether it's deserved or not. It made me feel guilty just thinking those thoughts. So that was around the time I just kind of forewent illustration in any capacity and just kind of doubled down on technology, startups, and UX design and product design, etc.
Yeah, that's interesting that you had that. When did you know that you're like, I'm stealing someone's job and I'm feeling guilty for it?
Yeah, probably around my mid-20s was around when I started to get serious about like deciding on kind of like the all of my man hours to one thing.
Right.
And it I started turning down jobs. That was really it. I was, in my opinion, I was putting out like really not good work, and they were still getting published and stuff. And I just was like, I don't know if I could keep doing this. And also it just took forever to do. So I just kind of had to make a decision. I just didn't want to do it anymore, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. Well, it's good you came to that realization. And so I wanted to talk about the financial freedom part. So tell me a little bit more about that, because there's always this like not in product design, but like illustration things, like there's almost like the starving artist kind of mentality. But what is it you wanted to create something that would give you financial freedom? Do you want to get a job? Did you want to start a business? Like what drove you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's a few things. I think the financial freedom part of it was baked in really early. I knew, maybe not like consciously, but I kind of always knew like underneath that if you had like capital, basically, if you had a good amount of money, you can choose to do things, and then you can sort of affect other people in some capacity, right? And again, I didn't know the specifics of how that worked, but as I grew older, I realized like kind of more what that was. And and even without knowing kind of fully what that meant, I always kind of knew that like the people paying the bills kind of were also doing whatever kind of they wanted, right? A little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So that I always kind of realized, um, so to loop it back to the question you asked, I also always felt that kind of creativity was scalable, right? Like if you genuinely create something good, you can kind of like take it everywhere, right? And if you were someone that can create value from nothing, that had to be worth something, right? So I always felt like, that was an important attribute to have, right? What I didn't understand back then, which I know now, was that illustration is just kind of a sliver in the value chain of things, right? And you could be great at it, but you also the art game is kind of its own like hustle. And but I think the foundation of it was kind of on point. This idea that like that if you create something good enough, people will follow. I think that came from my love of art and my kind of understanding of what art does to people, and how it affected me. So I kind of focused my attention there. I think because of some of those things I had mentioned about like understanding, like if you had if you had money basically, and it came from something you're good at, you could do, whatever you kind of wanted. So I'm still kind of chasing that, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. The fact that like you can create value from nothing, right? That's worth a lot. And I think that's where a lot of creatives and people undersell themselves.
Yeah.
And like they'll take whatever is given as opposed to getting what you deserve, right? And like I see that a lot in all design, in all creative spaces, whether it's product design, whether it's illustration, animation, whatever. Ad agencies are the worst. I don't want to say it all. Sorry, that's a bad thing that I just said. Not in broad strokes, but agencies historically tend to pay people enough not to quit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a place where people grow. And I know there's a lot of agencies that buck that trend now, and a lot of companies that buck that trend. But that's something I think for people to understand is like, if you have the skill to create value from nothing, from code, from a blank screen, and you can create value from that, that's worth so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So thank you. And now I want to get into your quote. Before we started recording, you said you're a blue collar worker in a white collar world.
Yeah.
Or white collar space. Tell us a little bit more about what that means to you.
Yeah. So again, I'll try to explain this without being too long-winded, because it is just something I think about every so often, and it kind of dawned on me that this is what we do. I think of like, if you think of blue collar workers, right? You think of construction workers and just kind of manual labor type work. But I realized, again, trying to figure out finances and stuff, construction workers at a high level make really good money, right? And we're just trying to find parallels, because I think when you're in a space like technology, it's really hard to get grounded sometimes. Everything's a little fake, right? Software is not really real until people are paying for it, and it's actually you doing something with it. So I was just trying to find things that grounded me, and then it occurred to me that like the analogy I used growing up, or at least when I was in my career, was that kind of building a website is a lot like making a house, right? And a house has architects, and it has people building, the building blocks of those things, right? And I think when I started to look realistically at the value, like of product design in the chain of value in a tech stack, if you will, or even an organization stack, we sit somewhere kind of in the build space, and like those folks, when you're thinking like nuts and bolts on pieces of paper, and you're like managing resources and trying to figure out where you fit in, it became apparent to me that what I am is just a blue collar worker, really. Like I'm just building stuff. I'm putting bricks together. I do it at a high level, and it gets me, a good income, but that's the reality of what I do. And I think that helped me reframe some of I like to think it keeps me grounded, but it kind of makes me feel like I know exactly what I'm contributing to a space, and it helps me kind of like figure out like where my lane is, right? So it's like I realistically, I can talk about how design is great and how it influences organizations and stuff and whatever, like how valuable it is. But at the end of the day, I push pixels, right? I change font sizes, and like Helvetica versus like whatever design system font you have, like those are my day-to-day decisions, right? And it's like, I'm just nudging things around. So it really does feel like I'm putting bricks together, blue collar work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've never heard someone talk about it that way, right? And it's just in a digital space, right?
Yeah.
So you're constructing in a digital space instead of a physical space. Um,
Yeah, that's where it comes from, at least for me.
yeah, yeah, that's a cool perspective. And thank you for sharing that. The thing I also want to get into is what struggles did you face, or did you have to, or challenges did you have to overcome? Let's start with that because I have a good follow up question. But yeah, were there any struggles or challenges that you had to overcome during your career,
Yeah.
deciding anything like that?
I mean, there's a ton. There's a ton, and it's like it's hard to choose the one. I think. Um, I mean, legitimacy, right? Number one. I think when you're a design, this is actually a good segue. Like when you're a designer or you call yourself a designer, there's so many different kinds of images people have of what a designer is and who they are, right? And when I started off doing design, it still feels that way. Like people didn't really understand kind of like what the contribution of a designer is to like an organization, right? They almost always equate a designer to like a visionary, right? And that's I would argue that's misguided because it's kind of a burdensome expectation to have for someone that you are actually looking at as an IC, right? It's like how can you expect someone to be like Steve Jobs level like IQ when you're also paying them the level of like an IC, right? So
Right.
like this weird this weird discrepancy of kind of like expectation versus kind of like what you can actually provide, I think is kind of at the heart of a lot of like designer specific struggles, where they're always kind of like fighting for what they believe to be a valuable perspective and what the organization perceives to be something else, on top of like what they feel like you should actually be delivering versus like what you feel like is your expertise to deliver. I think that's if we're really diving into my career overall, I think a lot of challenges kind of stem from that tension, and I feel like it's a kind of a classic tension, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's like I've seen this slippery slope, like, and I've seen this movie a lot, right? Where it's like, where does the PM stop and start? Where does the design, and for folks listening, the product manager, where does the PM start and stop, and where does the designer start and stop, and vice versa, right? Where what is out of line for a designer to do, and most places won't say it's out of line, but like it's a classic struggle, and things that I was lucky enough in places like Zappos and Netflix, everyone had a seat at the table, right? Because they brought perspectives. But I've also seen places where design did not have a seat at the table. And I've coached a lot of people that were like, people don't understand design. They don't value design. And I think it's the first statement. They don't understand design. So if you don't understand design, then you don't know how to value it. Or you overvalue it. And to your point, you're like, come on, designer, come up with the next best thing. You're like, well, you're the one that has all the context and all the stuff, and you're asking me to come up with the vision,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know if any of this rings true for you, but it's some of the struggles that I've seen across like design organizations and how or where they fit within the larger scheme of things.
Yeah, and I think to be honest, I see it a lot in kind of two places, which is an organization that's like a startup basically, that's like run by people that don't understand what the tech stack or the design stack really kind of like adds to the organization. The other thing is like if it's like really old, right, and they're just trying to transition to being more digitally flexible, that they know that they need designers, but then they also kind of like poo-poo the role a little bit because they're like, again, it's like to what I just said, actually, just they're pixel pushers, they make pretty things, right? And I think, it's the organization that really understands what a designer does tends to be more open-minded, right? They're like, we need to go in a different direction. I am aware that like designers add value. I may not know how, but I am kind of open to figuring out like how we can start a communication pipeline where, we can start to have a real dialogue about like what a designer's perspective is versus a product perspective, right? And those are a little harder to come by. They do exist, but that's something that I've picked up over the years,
Yeah. So the follow-up question I want to ask you is, we're obviously both people of color. Has that helped? Has that hurt? Has it had no effect on your career? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, they definitely did not help, like if I straight up, okay, without getting too impassioned by it, And
That's
listen,
okay. Get impassioned by it. It's okay.
I will say this. I will provide the context that there is a fine line between like what is truth and what is reality, right? Excuse me, what is perceived truth and what is actually reality. So
Mhm.
like my perception of how things are occurring, is arguably not the actual truth, right? So everything is colored by a subjectivity that's unique to my eyes, right?
Right.
That's how I feel. Um, that being said, that being said, um, I can't like you know how I mentioned something about like being seen as valuable, right? Or having a place in an organization. Like what gets really tough, like when you're working through your career is when you start to see your peers who you feel are like, I don't know, without putting anyone, throwing anyone under the bus, you feel objectively better than in comparison to like in raw skills, like
Mhm.
speed, efficiency, any of those things you can argue about. It's like when you see them kind of like excel, but not only that, like they're getting support that you don't otherwise get because of one
Mhm.
thing or another. And you just kind of like, all right, it's consistently happening to me. Like, I wonder why that is. Oh, it's consistently like the people in the room tend to be of a certain skin color, like that's, I'm not saying that that's the reason why, but the optics of it tend to make me feel that way, So it's like, and then you start to go down the list, and then you start to like really pay attention to like, well, let's look at who's in the upper management class of people. It's like, oh yeah, look, there's not a single person of color, like let's say, not, this is not even to like get into like the gender equality piece of it, right? And you start to
Right.
put things together. Now, do I feel like it's affected me? Like I feel like it has, right? And I can't point to any specific instance, but I know what it has done to my psyche and like what I've had to do to overcome it, right? So I do think that there's something there, and I feel like maybe directly or indirectly I felt it, and it's a real thing. In my opinion, it's a real thing. So
Yeah, I mean, it's getting marginally better, but I do believe it's a real thing, right? And from places that I've been and I've seen, and I won't call out all these different places. If you look at just pure data, you can say, sure, like we're making a dent because people of color now represent, say, 40% of the workforce. But then you start to dissect and you start to look at what are the roles
yeah,
and where do these people work, like what jobs do they do, things like
yeah,
that. You start to see, and this is data. This is not me assuming. So most women in the industry in tech organizations are going to be in marketing, comms, right? Like those organizations, right?
hmm,
Um, and then most minorities are usually not in executive leadership, right? They make up middle management and things like that. So if people really want to have these conversations and hold a mirror up, they need to look at the diversity of like their entire organization and dissect it, not just like, look, our overall numbers are getting better. Like, yeah, it doesn't hurt to hire women of color into your marketing organization as coordinators, right? Like
yeah,
that's like putting your thumb on the scale. Like, no, let's really look at what's going on here. I know I will say Netflix did a pretty good job of this, doing like blind studies where it's like, okay, take gender, race, like all things off the table, and how does it look
mhm,
like equality wise, and then put all that stuff back, and then it starts to actually look fair.
yeah,
Like there's not a lot of companies that are doing those kinds of things.
yeah, and it's hard. I'm not gonna like. I What I mean by that too is that like it institutionalized like systemic things are hard to change, and I remember when I was younger, I was like, it should get better, maybe in my lifetime. But what I didn't compute is that how slow it is, right? It's like it's generational. So I've started to look at it kind of like I maybe my son will have a better kind of like outcome in these contexts. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's all we can really hope for, right? So I try to teach my kids like not to see in color, but also take pride in that you look different, right? And you
Yeah.
come from somewhere else, right? And don't like take take some of these things at face value. You got to like really understand how these things work.
Yeah.
Because I mean, when they're like 6 years old, maybe it doesn't matter as much. But
Yeah.
as they start getting 9, 10, 11, 12, you start to see the segmentation of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like I want to make sure that they have the right tools and have the
Yeah.
right mindsets to be successful. Because I came from a typical Asian upbringing where it's like you get a good job, you do hard work, you
Yeah.
never quit. You know, like
Yeah.
my parents expected me to be a doctor, lawyer, nurse, whatever, and be that for like 40 years, retire, and then
Yeah.
like whatever, right? Like I don't want that for my kids.
Yeah, and it's funny too because it's like I had similar upbringing. I think what my parents didn't quite compute was like the immigrant experience and like what that does, and I think that's just something I think about often. And you're totally right. You're on point about that too. And I think less so not just taking pride in kind of like your own identity is, but also understanding like how that's could be like a segmentation thing like later on, like and how do you prepare like my son's 10, he's almost 11 now. How do you prepare him for the idea that like some kids just might not like you because of the way you look? Now I hope it doesn't happen. Maybe times have changed, but I think about that every so often.
Yeah, absolutely. And it becomes even more real when you have kids, right? Because like we've grown up in it and we kind of like, okay, yeah, I saw that coming, or like,
Yeah.
yeah, but our kids are just learning this real time.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, and I love them and love the curiosity, but it also makes me like, oh man, you're dealing with this already and you're
Oh,
9. Right? Um,
so
but
true.
anyway, so yeah, so thank you for sharing that. I know that sharing that experience without getting anyone in trouble. So I really appreciate that. Um, yeah, moving into like, so you've been in the industry for 15 years,
Yeah.
knowing what you know now, say 19-year-old Phil, 18-year-old Phil, what advice would you have for him?
Yeah, I would just advise him to stay humble. Like, I don't think that's something I understood nearly enough. I think I grew up more hot-headed, for a variety of reasons. And, talking about all the obstacles that exist, like I don't think I understood kind of the gravity of what they actually are. And if I had a cooler head, maybe, or if I was more willing to kind of like accept like a lesser role, maybe I would have had more success faster, right, in my career. So I think I would advise him to just try to um, understand that the world existed before you, right, and it'll continue to exist. And I think the best way to kind of navigate it is to understand like how you fit and then accept it kind of gracefully and then figure out how to surpass people's expectations within it. I wish I learned that pretty early, which I did not clearly as I
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's better late than never.
yeah. That's true.
Yeah. Um, I had a good question, but maybe it'll come back. Oh, yeah, here it is. This is one that I had to work through with a lot of people on my team, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it. I didn't prep you on this one, so
Man,
this is going to be raw and uncut.
let's do it.
Most people think growth in our spaces means people leadership.
Hmm.
So, what would you consider growth, and what's the path, the non-traditional path to growth, like that you've seen, like maybe the IC path to growth,
Yeah.
or like how have you asserted your leadership, not in a like VP role?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's funny. It's funny because one of the questions you gave me a sheet for the listeners. It's about books, right? And I kind of reread some of the books that I read to prepare for this conversation. But the one that I read that affected me was called "The Effective Executive," right? And I only bring that up because I, similarly to your point, used to think that in order to, influence, in order to have an impact, you had to be like a manager or just some executive. But what that book really kind of informed me, especially in my 20s, was like, you don't really have to be anything like that to affect change. An organization, I mean, they lay out pretty clearly, it's not always fair, right? But it doesn't mean that you have to like subjugate yourself to lesser than, just because like you're not, whatever title or whatever stature, because in the bubble that you exist, you may have some influence that could provide a better outcome, right? So that's helped me. And I don't know if it's like sorely just that too. I think it's a lot of it's just conversations too. But I think like I started to really realize, going back to that point earlier about roles, like figuring out like what the expectations people have of me are, and realizing that like, okay, I guess, if we look at the idea of leadership as just kind of what it stands for, which is leading people to things, then like, I think I can do this version of it in this way. And not only that, it's like the return on that investment, if you will, makes sense for what I hope to accomplish now. Whereas, I don't need to be so greedy as to like ask for more later. Right. So that to me has been kind of the more clarifying thing, is that like I'm a lead IC at Experian right now. Right. And right now I have no decisions or no ambitions even to be a manager, because that management class is so impacted. But it doesn't lessen kind of like how I feel going into the role day to day, which is that my manager expects me to have answers to things that she doesn't understand, right? So like it's incumbent on me to provide those solutions, but not only that, help people understand it too. And I think the acceptance of that, at least for me, is kind of growth, right? It's like I'm not asking for more than I think like I need. This is exactly what I think I can do, and I think I think ownership of that may be exemplary of leadership, hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, and it just, I love the answer, and it just illustrates that leadership shows up in lots of different ways. Like people assume, to your point, oh, the only way to have true growth or to become a leader is to become a people manager, but that's not always the path. I know designers who've been ICs for like 25 plus years.
Yeah.
It's because they just love being an IC. Doesn't mean they have less influence. They, if anything, probably have more influence than their director, because their peer groups, his peer group respects him so much more, right? For like all the things that he's able to do.
Yeah.
So like that's one thing that I want to reinforce with people listening. Like it's not a one size fits all. Like leadership's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Your path to growth is not a one size fits all. There are many options.
100%. I can't echo that statement enough too. And I think it's really worth, for people who are hoping to get an understanding of this, like looking at some of the quote unquote famous like creatives in the world and like figuring out where they stack in an organization. Right. And I think you'll be surprised to find that they're just, like as we described, they're just, I don't know, animators or directors or whatever doing this one thing. And the organization stack is like, there's VPs and EVPs there too, I'm sure, but it doesn't bother them. They still get their glories and their flowers and what have you, because they're focused on the work. So
yeah, that's a great point. I know a lot of like great creatives that they're ICs, they're like maybe don't even sign their name on the work, but I know who did the work.
Yeah.
And they're amazing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And they still have influence. Maybe they don't think they do, but they still have influence.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay, lightening things up a little bit. So for you, what do you have, or do you lean on mentors? Are you a mentor yourself? Like what role has mentorship played in your journey?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up, I've had to mentor myself. I think mentorship really, I mean, it comes from obviously needing to be in a physical space with people. But the other thing too, is that like, I think generally people who take mentees, they see a reflection of themselves in others. Right. And I think they want to help nurture that. I don't think in my career I felt like I've met anyone who looked at me and was like, I know exactly how you feel. Right. So I've never been able to like, even like, I also didn't really have anyone in my immediate vicinity where I can like reach out and be like, I want this person to be a mentor. Right. So no, my mentors are authors and people that I've like, watched talks on, kind of like absorb their perspective on things. And I try to keep a level head about it. And that's really kind of how I came to be.
Yeah. Well, one, that's rough, but also enlightening. Because like you're mentoring yourself. Like just in general with like my coaching practice, people already have a lot of negative self-talk, right? And like I just did a workshop today on
Yeah.
imposter syndrome, and like people are not kind to themselves,
Mm,
right? People are kind to others, like because we're just human beings. But
yeah.
the way we treat ourselves, the way we talk about ourselves, is not often the best, right?
Yeah.
It can be destructive, and that's
Yeah.
why people suffer from imposter syndrome.
Sure.
But how do you do that? How do you navigate that? Like, and I'd love to hear who you follow, who you read, like all that stuff. But
Yeah.
how do you combat the negative self-talk that I don't know if you have, but a lot of people have?
Yeah. Well, I do, but they form in different ways, right? I think like I um it's funny because I was looking up imposter syndrome. I'm not entirely sure if I've had the version of it that's like described in articles and what have you. And I think I was trying to figure out why that is. And I think so much of that is I've always, and I still feel this way, even if it's not like reflected in my results, but like I've always felt like I have kind of like exceptionalism within me, right? And I've always felt like it's just not understood, right? And so, um, and the reason why I say that is because I've over time had to reframe that thinking. It's obviously kind of an arrogant perspective if it's like if it's untethered, right? But I will frame that as one of the reasons why like negative self talk doesn't didn't really affect me too much, right? Because what that does for the psyche is that it kind of creates kind of like a combative like perspective to it. It's kind of like,
Hmm.
so if I have a notion that someone's talking crap about me, I'll just be like, well, whatever, that is what it is, like let's look, why are they look at themselves in the mirror or what have you? Like I would think those thoughts as I went along, and you know, I don't know if that informed my work to be any better, but that has helped me kind of like um, progress and kind of deal with it in that way. And I think as for like people who I was inspired by, like I grew up listening to a lot of like hip hop, right? And I think in college it was a lot of indie music and punk music, and a
Hmm.
lot of that was indicative of people who kind of like fought their own way, who were like always misunderstood and just kind of like came out the other side being like, no, actually, like I had it right the whole time. You guys just needed to catch up, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I've carried that thought with me, and then I've tried to find other speakers, like entrepreneurs who kind of reflected that attitude, and it just helped inspire me to continue to feel like my time is just around the corner, right? It's just like it's just I need to show my value in a way that's obvious, right? So like it's not even questionable. That's just kind of how I fought through it.
Yeah, that's a cool thing that you inherently have value, and just people are just like misunderstanding the expressions of it.
I mean, it works
Right.
against you if you're like, yeah, if you're,
Well, I mean, yeah, but that's the silent confidence versus the loud arrogance, right?
yeah, it's true.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Um, okay, cool. And I know we're coming up on time, but what are you up to now? Like, so you're a lead designer at Experian. Do you have anything else that you're working on?
yeah. So, well, thank you for asking. That's a nice segue. But I actually started a business. It's an online store. It's my partner and I, in particular, my wife and I, excuse me. We started an online store selling baby products. Our launch product is something called a baby lounger for anyone who's a new parent. These are cushions that help kind of like keep your child in place when you need to look away for a minute. But this is kind of what I feel, if I were to speak bluntly, like kind of where my career is naturally progressing towards, right? I've always been a fan of entrepreneurship. So my day job basically is lead product designer at Experian. I moonlight as, I guess, an owner of a small business. And if I can quickly plug what it is, it's
Sure.
Bonjour Akachan, bonjour-akachan.co. Akachan as in infant in Japanese, bonjour as in bonjour in French. So if you're curious, please take a look. And if you have friends who have kids, please tell them to buy.
Yeah, no shameless plugs here for sure. And we'll definitely, if you missed it, the link will be in the show notes. And what was it about baby products? Just curious.
There's a ton of reasons, but I think the short and sweet answer is um, I was looking for an opportunity in a space that I felt like I could have an impact in, and baby products, in a weird way, I've always kind of felt inspired by. Like like cartoons may not make sense for adults, I guess, right? But if you repackage it as a baby product, suddenly it's like it's incredibly valuable to people, and people can live vicariously through those products. So I always felt like if you have kids and then you have a childish kind of like nature, you can actually live vicariously through them, right? And use that as an excuse. And I think maybe that's part of the reason why I was inspired by this category. So
nice. You're like, I wish I had that when I was little. Let me just
yeah.
make it.
Yeah, like, or like,
I know some kid will want it.
Or like, why doesn't this like, why aren't nicely designed versions of this exist in the market, right? Just something that's like simple as that, So it's a start. We'll see where it goes, but hopefully.
Yeah, and how long has it been around?
I literally just launched the website 2 weeks ago, so we are kind of in the throes of marketing. I'm solidifying the email pipeline, and we're going to start marketing on Instagram, where hopefully the new parents are at. So
nice.
Yeah.
And don't forget to update the show notes. So when people are listening to this, they're probably listening to this a month or two after we recorded it. So
yeah.
it's probably they're probably like your brand is sliding into their feed, hopefully.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed.
Especially if they're parents to be.
Yeah.
Cool. Right on. And I did want to ask the books. So you already mentioned Effective Executive. Before we wrap, what is another book? Maybe what's your favorite book that you would recommend to folks picking up?
I want to do two things really quickly, because I think I had an answer to a question you asked, but it wasn't quite the answer.
Sure.
But I'll segue that afterwards. But the book that I'd love to shout out, aside from the Effective Executive, is one called Predictably Irrational. I don't know if anyone else has mentioned that in your show. Predictably Irrational is basically a book by a behavioral psychologist named Dan Ariely, identifying the ways in which humans are unfortunately consistently prone to making irrational decisions. And the real life examples he tends to use are in pricing, like in business pricing, and how we tend to spend more on things we don't need because it makes sense for us in a social context, for instance, or like in some other like emotionally valuable way. But it's an entire book about the research into kind of understanding how you can understand why economics are what they are based on people's kind of predictable routes to making irrational decisions. So that's a good book relative to kind of like reframing your thinking of like what is conventionally, normal, like what is conventional versus like kind of seeing things a different way. So I would highly encourage people to read that.
I'm going to check it out for sure.
Yeah,
I know I've made irrational decisions in my life for sure.
The other thing I wanted to mention is I want to go back to that question of mentorship, because I didn't have a mentor, but I had a best friend, and my best friend was also my boss at one point, and he had an incredible effect on me in my career. I could literally define like who I was before I met him and who I was afterwards. And his name, I'm going to shout him out, Joven Cronin Wildsmith. Right now, he is a partner at a climate tech firm called Celium. If you guys are interested in any of that in that space, hit him up, and do not tell him I mentioned his name out here, because I don't know what he would say. But either way,
I'm sure he'll appreciate it.
Maybe not an exact mentor, but he definitely affected kind of like how I can have a moral compass in a space that can be quite challenging for someone like me, who had a hard time figuring out his own value. He really clarified, like, no, you're legit, man. So,
yeah, I mean, the thing about, I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad you shouted him out, because the thing about mentorship, it's not always explicit, right? So like sometimes you don't know you're in a mentorship relationship, and sometimes you don't know you're actually mentoring the other person just as much as they're providing you mentorship and advice. Right. So yeah, maybe there's more nuggets out there for you that like, oh, actually this person and this person along the way. And it could have been, I give people credit for things I didn't want to be like. Like there were some horrible people that I was around in the past. I'm like, I'm never going to be like that. Right. So like that is an informal mentorship, knowing what kind of person I did not want to be.
Yeah. It's a really good point too. It's yeah, and I can say this, in my own personal life too, like what not to be by looking at the mistakes that otherwise someone has made. So
Cool. Right on. All right, Phil, any last words before you wrap up here? Last bits of advice?
no, man, you are amazing. This is incredible. I am happy for your audience and your community of people that get to engage with this on a daily or a weekly. So thanks for having me, and I'm really glad to have a new peer and a new colleague in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for taking the time. And I'm sure I'll have you. I want to ask you some other things. I'll shoot you a note because there's some stuff I want to get into. We didn't get into like anything AI, anything like
Oh
that,
yeah,
but I would love to get into that with you in another episode if you're down.
absolutely, man. Anytime.
Cool. Right on. All right, all. That's another episode in the books. Creative Leadership with Heart. Phil Rhie. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
Take it easy.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creative Leadership with Heart. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. If you're ready to make huge, lasting change in your life, then what are you waiting for? What will your life look like if you took action today? What would it look like if you didn't? If you're serious and you're ready, book your free strategy session today and let's make your future a reality.